Once upon a time there was a shoemaker. He was a most industrious man and spent his whole day in working on fine leather boots and shoes. From early morning to late at night he would hammer and stitch and sew at his bench. His work was of the best, and for many years he had only to get out a piece of leather and a needle when someone would open his door and say, "Ah, there you are, shoemaker. At last I find you in a quiet moment." But not for long. See these shoes I am wearing? They are so full of holes I might just as well walk across the puddles in my bare feet. So make me some new boots of your very finest leather, and hurry now, for I need them at once. And so it went for many years. The shoemaker had more work than he could possibly do, even though he kept at it all through the night. Often, as the church bells would ring out the early hours, the first rays of sunshine would find him fast asleep from weariness, stretched over his workbench. One day he grew sick, so sick that he could not work for a long, long time. The days stretched into weeks, and the weeks stretched into months, and finally, when the snow again lay on the trees outside his windows, the shoemaker knew that a year had passed, and that he faced the cold winter ahead of him without food or money or even wood for his fire. There was only enough flour for one more loaf of bread. With tears in her eyes, his wife patted it together and put it in the oven to bake. The shoemaker had just enough leather left to make a pair of shoes for some nobleman. If only he could finish them, they would easily be sold, and all would be well in their household again. So carefully he cut out a pair of fine riding boots. Carefully he measured the last inches of his fine sewing thread. Carefully he sorted out the few remaining nails for the soles and heels. There. He had just enough to complete them and not one thing more. Well, as long as a man had one loaf of bread in the oven and enough work for one more day, perhaps life wasn't so bad after all. By this time, night had come, and the poor, tired shoemaker fell fast asleep at his bench before he had even started to work. When morning came, he opened his eyes, and to his astonishment, there on the bench before him stood the finished pair of shoes. They were completely sewn with perfect little stitches. The soles had been nailed firmly in place, and there was even a pair of gay red tassels swinging from the boot tops. The shoemaker rubbed his eyes to be sure he wasn't dreaming. No, there they were, as perfect a pair of fine boots as he had ever seen. That day he sold them for twice what he had been able to get for any other boots, but they were so trimly turned that they were more than worth the price. Quickly the shoemaker purchased another fine piece of leather, and with the last gold piece his good wife bought a fat sausage and some raisins for a new loaf of bread. That night the shoemaker again laid out his materials on the workbench. He cut out 2 pairs of shoes this time and went off to bed, hardly daring to hope for the same good fortune again. But when he awoke in the morning, there stood the 2 pairs of shoes, finished as perfectly as before. He called loudly to his good wife, and she came running to see. Yes, there were the same perfect stitches, the same care in nailing the soles, and this time there was even a fine leather buckle on the toe of each shoe. Oh, how happy they were. The shoemaker and his good wife sang and danced joyfully about the room. The kettle on the hearth set up a merry whistling, the flames of the cheery fire snapped and crackled in the grate, and the cottage seemed warm and cozy once again. "Oh, wife," laughed the shoemaker, "we shall have a little celebration. I know that you have 2 brown eggs in the basket on the shelf. Well, we shall have them for our breakfast. both of them. And let's hurry, for after breakfast I will open the door and call everyone passing by on the street to come in and see these shoes. I'm sure they will be sold quite easily, and I shall go to the tanner's for still another piece of leather. And he placed the shoes in the window over his workbench, opening the casement so that the morning sunlight would stream in over them. Soon a customer came in. Yes, a fine pair of leather shoes with handsome buckles would be just right for him. He was to go to his wedding today, and these would be the very thing to make him the perfect bridegroom. Here, he said, take these pieces of gold, Shoemaker, and may good fortune and happiness as great as my own fall in your path. And he went out the door with the new shoes on his feet. The shoemaker could hardly believe his eyes as he counted out the pieces of gold. Why, he was almost rich. Tonight they would have a little coffee with their sausage, he and his good wife, and there would be enough to share with all their friends. By evening, the shoemaker had easily sold the second pair of beautiful shoes and had run out to get more leather. This time he bought enough to make 4 pairs of shoes. And so it continued from day to day. Finally, his good wife said, let us hide in the shadows and watch to see what happens during the night. Some kind neighbor has been helping us, and I should like to know who he is so that I may in turn help him. So the shoemaker and his good wife blew out the candles, threw more wood on the fire, and hid in the shadows behind the door. The snow fell softly on the roof. The icicles hung like silver spears in the moonlight, and the frost made little pictures on the window panes. All the village had gone to bed. The night watchman had long passed the door with his lantern, and even the bells in the church hung silent as if asleep. The shoemaker and his wife waited and waited in the shadows, and just as they were about to give up hope, the window over the workbench blew open. A few snowflakes came whirling in, and in another second there followed 6 tiny little men no bigger than twigs on a tree. They called to one another in merry voices and seemed to be the happiest creatures in the world, even though every one of them was in the most shabby clothing. My, how ragged they looked. The buttons were gone from their jackets, their little elbows stuck through their sleeves, and they ran about in the winter's night completely barefoot. Oh, how cold they must have been. But they ran across the room to the hearth and danced into the fireplace close to the glowing embers, and they moved so nimbly their feet twinkled in and out like the flames themselves. They laughed and jumped and danced about and rubbed their hands together until they were warm once again. Then back they scampered to the workbench. There they set to work. One measured off the lengths of heavy thread. Another held up the needle while a third pushed the thread through the eye. The fourth and fifth jumped up and down on the handles of the scissors, laughing and singing as they cut the leather into perfect forms, and the last one stitched it all together. They worked so fast that the shoemaker and his wife could not even see the work being done. And after the pairs of shoes stood completed upon the bench, the 6 little men danced and danced until they could hardly stand from weariness. They slid down the needle, they chased one another across the shining blades of the scissors, they wound themselves into a spool of heavy thread, and even hid inside the shoemaker's thimble and rolled it about like a tiny barrel. But soon the first gray light of the dawn came in the window, and the 6 tiny men disappeared as quickly as they had come, leaving the shoemaker and his wife with their eyes as round as saucers. Wife, said the shoemaker, we have seen the 6 little elves with our own eyes. Let us do something to reward them. If you will make some clothes for them, I will make 6 pairs of shoes. Why, indeed I will, replied the wife. The poor little things, they must be shivering with the cold. So the shoemaker set to work immediately, And in a little while he had turned out 6 tiny pairs of red leather shoes with curving toes, and on the end of each he hung the smallest tassel you ever saw. And his wife went to work, and in a little while she had knitted 6 pairs of yellow wool stockings, so small that they would fit upon your little finger. And she made them 6 pairs of red woolen trousers and tiny white wool shirts, and even 6 blue jackets with rows of yellow buttons down the front. And finally, she made them 6 red tasseled caps, no bigger than the shoemaker's smallest thimble. They were perfect. That night, the shoemaker didn't put out the leather to be made into new shoes. Instead, he and his wife carefully laid out the little suits and caps and shoes on the bench and hid behind the door again. Once more, the tiny elves came in at the window. At first, they began to run up and down the bench, but as soon as they saw the clothes, they stood still. They stared and they stared. Finally, one picked up the red tasseled cap and put it upon his head. With shouts of laughter, the rest followed, and in a twinkling there they stood, each completely dressed in the new clothes from top to toe. Round and round they chased each other, the little tassels on their shoes bobbing up and down with each step. They laughed and took hands and danced about in a ring, and they sang songs in voices no louder than the thin chirp of a cricket. Then daylight came, and out the window they ran in all their warm new clothes, and they were never seen again. But the shoemaker and his wife had good fortune until the end of their days. There was always wood for the fire, flour for an extra loaf of bread, and always more than enough fine leather for the finest shoes in the land. And sometimes in the cold winter nights, the shoemaker and his good wife would wake with a start, thinking they heard the laughter and singing of the little elves. And I'm sure they did. Aren't you?